Hey everybody. So now we're going to look at chapter 24, which is World War II. So 1937 to 1945. We look at the causes of the war, we look at the war, and what happens in the immediate. Well, no, we really won't look much at the aftermath of the war. This is primarily from the beginning to the end. And then chapter 25 will deal with what America looks like after the war. The rise of fascism. World War II would lead to the death of over 50 million people and another 100 million injured. The worst war ever in history. It was a global war fought on all the continents, fought in all the oceans, all the seas. Every industrialized nation on earth was involved, and most unindustrialized nations were touched by this. One of the worst things to ever happen in human history, caused by humans. So the 1930s, we have depression striking most of the world, not just America. We spent our time talking about the American Depression last chapter. It should be noted that our depression spread globally, and this became a global depression. As democracy fails around the world, as countries strive to deal with and adjust to mass unemployment, mass homelessness, poverty, mass uprisings, riots in the streets. We see many places militarism start to dominate, sometimes out of necessity, simply to keep the peace. But many people, many leaders use this as a way to take power militarily. Fascism, which I'll explain in a moment, starts to take hold across the world in multiple countries. We will specifically talk about Japan, Germany, Italy, and even Spain, although I won't spend much time talking about Spain. Spain has so many of its own problems during the 30s and 40s that it actually ends up in its own civil war, which inadvertently sort of removes it from the World War for the most part. Fascism. There's a complicated definition. I'll keep it simple. These are militaristic governments that are usually led by a dictator, authoritarian governments. They oppose democracy. They oppose capitalism. They oppose individual rights. Now, at the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles left these two countries, Japan and Italy, which become fascist. They were left out. Japan and Italy were pretty much left out of the treaty. I think I've mentioned it before. Some historians would say one of the significant causes of World War II was the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles hurt too many people's feelings. Only that is a gross understatement. It left countries reeling. It left countries in economic depression. The Treaty of Versailles sought nothing less than to cripple Germany forever. I mean, it meant to hurt Germany for decades. Um, so these countries try to struggle, try to survive under the either they were left out of the treaty and got absolutely nothing out of it because all of the advantages and the gains went to other European countries, um, or they were actually damaged by it. Japan needed resources, Japan needed markets for its goods, and Japan began a process of military expansion and colonialism. The leadership in Japan felt that they had been left out of the treaty, but generally speaking, just left out of colonialism and imperialism across the world that European countries have been engaging in for centuries, and the U.S. had been engaging in for the better part of 100 years. The scramble for resources, opportunities, markets. Japan was probably the only truly industrialized country in Asia. And they felt, and they learned much of that from us and France. And they felt that they wanted their piece of the pie, and they targeted China. It began a process of military expansion in Asia. They invaded Manchuria. Let's stay with China for a moment. They invaded Manchuria, which is northeast China, in 1931. They began a full invasion of China in 1937, and no one stopped them. In the case of Italy, Benito Mussolini took charge around 22, proclaiming himself a dictator. He wanted the same thing as Japan: expansion, natural resources, believing as well. Because even though Italy was the enemy in World War I initially, by the end of the war, Italy had switched sides and had actually joined the Allies. And so Italy was technically a winner in World War I on the side of America, England, and France. Well, Italy felt that they should have gotten more out of it. They switched sides. They chose to help the Allies. They chose to fight against Germany. They felt that they should have gotten a reward for that. And so we see Mussolini using this type of demagoguery, stoking people's fears and angers and prejudices to really get the Italian people to follow him into war with other countries, claiming that Italians had been basically shafted, not given their fair due. They invade Ethiopia in 1935. Ethiopia had the notoriety of, in many people's books, the only really Christian African country in North and Central Africa. Um, and so there was this, I don't know what you want to call it, and I don't know exactly the terminology for it, this belief that Ethiopians were kindred spirits to Italy, which was this heart of Christianity, Catholic Christianity. And so it seemed to make sense, at least in Mussolini's eyes, that Italy should rejoin the fold, as though Ethiopia had been part of Italy in the past or something. There's a certain mythology involved in this, which I'm not going to get into, that goes back centuries. Nonetheless, Ethiopia is invaded as a fellow Christian nation, and they're going to save the Christians there. And of course, what they really were after were natural resources. They were looking for oil and gold and mineral resources in Ethiopia. In both cases, the League of Nations, which was the thing that was created at the end of World War I, the League of Nations did nothing. Condemn their actions. Slap on the hand. You're bad boys. Nothing. League of Nations had no power to do that. League of Nations had no military power, and it simply told them they should stop. They did not. The invasion of China and the invasion of Africa continued. These are just two small examples. Specifically, Germany, which was sort of the heart of this fascist aggression. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. That's sort of like president. I guess that's maybe the wrong way to put it, because there actually was a president. Um, he became the de facto ruler of Germany. Became chancellor in 33. He was given dictatorial powers. In other words, he was given the power to do anything to bring Germany out of the Depression. It was bad. The Depression in America reached about 25% unemployment as a nation. Germany reached 50%. The majority of their youth were not working, on the streets, and Hitler finds a way to put them to work. America does it by infrastructure. Hitler does it by putting them in uniform. They were suffering from post-World War I economic problems, and then you throw the Depression on top of that. Immediately, once he becomes chancellor, he issues several new laws. Again, he's given dictatorial powers, so he can do almost anything. He outlaws all political parties except his, the Nazi Socialist Party. He outlaws all other parties. And suddenly, overnight, Germany's a one-party political system, his party, and he's the leader of that party. How convenient, the Nazi Party. He desires nothing less than to completely overturn the Versailles Treaty, which had put reparations on Germany, where Germany had to pay back tens of billions of dollars, which Germany never had the money to do. That never even began to pay back the reparations it needed to pay back. He wants to overturn that. And another part of the Versailles Treaty, if you remember, Germany lost about a third of their country. They lost mines, they lost factories, they lost farms. Um, they lost much of their productive capacity. They were outlawed from making any type of war machines or weapons. It was very restrictive. Hitler wanted nothing less than to simply ignore all of it and do whatever he thought he could do to to fix the country from the depression, and of course empower himself at the same time. One of the tactics he used was this ideology of the German master race versus inferior races. Pretty much it was the German master race versus all others. Who were the inferiors? Well, generally speaking, everybody who isn't German, a white, but specifically targets like gypsies, Slavic peoples, which would be people from Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, but more broadly, gay, homosexual, black, anyone who didn't fit this perfect ideology of this perfect adult, perfectly fit and healthy, capable white person. Um, of course, who else were the enemies? The enemies were also anyone who challenged Hitler's domination of Germany, his outlawing of political parties, his martial law, his authoritarianism. Anyone who challenged him was an enemy. Although he framed it as this race war of whites versus everyone else. And to him, the way he framed it, which wasn't necessarily uncommon, race wasn't just about skin color. Race was about nationality, ethnic origin, even religion was aspects of race to Hitler and to many of these white supremacists. He blamed all the economic problems on the Jews and on these inferior peoples who were dragging the country down. 1935, he started rebuilding the military, started building up the military, repurposing factories, started building tanks and bombs and planes and weapons of war, all strictly against the Treaty of Versailles. No one stopped him. Each of these were small steps over several years. Then, around 35 or so, he signs the Axis Alliance, which is a military alliance, a defensive alliance between him, Italy, and Japan. So as of 1935, anyone in the know, anyone in positions of authority around the world, US, England, France, many other countries, had to have known what was happening. And we know they did from extensive writings and journals and articles and government documents. All the people in industrialized nations around the world realized what was happening. But no one did anything to stop Italy, Germany, or Japan, really. Nothing beyond an effective slap on the wrist. Now we'll look at America. The general public consensus in the United States was to be an isolationist. In other words, that the U.S. should not get involved in any hostilities in Europe. By the 1930s, the general consensus was we should not have gotten involved in World War I. Thank goodness we did. It's certainly conceivable if we hadn't got involved in World War I that Germany would have won that. Germany was doing very well in World War I until we got involved. World War II is a little different story. But just to put it all together, people just simply thought we should generally stay out of European affairs. We wanted them to buy our stuff, to buy our goods, but we wanted nothing to do with their economic or socio-political problems. It was all about Advantage America, everything that helped us, and it wasn't about getting involved in other people's problems. There were lots of efforts to keep us out of the war. Well, let me say this differently. There was no war in 35. We're talking 1935. But there was a lot of efforts to keep us out of any type of building aggressions in Europe. In 1935, it was obvious. Countries were building up weapons of war, Russia, Germany, Italy, Japan, England, France. They were all building. So it was very obvious already that something was coming. We simply wanted to stay out of it. And this is what we call isolationism. In 1935, Congress passes the Neutrality Act, which declares to the world we are going to remain neutral in any type of hostilities. And however, we will still sell goods to you. We will even still sell military goods to you. We followed this policy in World War I and we're following it in World War II, which is simply profiteering. We are willing to profit off of other people's misery. In essence, if they want to buy guns from us, we'll sell them guns. They want to buy bombs, we'll sell them bombs. They want to buy tanks from us, we'll sell them stuff. We'll sell them whatever they want as long as they pay for it. If you use that to go kill people, that's not our problem. Profiteering, war profiteering. We instituted a cash and carry policy. One of the big problems, one of the things that drew us into World War I was that the Germans kept sinking our ships. They kept sinking American ships. They sunk hundreds of our ships and killed thousands of our people, civilians and sailors. That's one of the big things that really drew us into World War I. And so we have this policy that says we're not going to use any ships to carry any military goods. If you want something from us, you're going to have to sail your ship over here, hand us a check or a bag of money, and then you can sail away with whatever you want on your ship. So if someone sinks a ship, it's going to be your ship with your people on it, not our problem. This cash and carry policy is really effective for, I don't know, maybe only a year or two. Because by 37, 38, we've pretty much abandoned this neutrality cash and carry policy. But we start off this way. And maybe this is simply the government's way to try and appease the American public. But also in 35, we are still in the height of the Depression. What we do realize, though, soon is by building military goods to feed the German, not the German, pardon me, the European war machine, and Japan, by the way, we gave a shit ton of stuff to Japan before we got in war with them. We gave them oil and supplies and all kinds of stuff. We helped fuel the German, the European, the Japanese war machine before we were their enemies. All for the profits, all for profit. Anyway, so people were challenging this and they had problems with this. The majority of Americans were isolationists. However, you must know there were some people that wanted us to get involved. There were some that were often called interventionists that wanted us to get directly involved. The Popular Front was this very loosely associated group of people all across America, typically intellectuals, social advocates, people who really believed that we should enter the war to protect the world from fascism, to protect the world from fascist attacks and fascist. Basically, fascism, the big argument they made was fascism, of course, denied people civil liberties and was, of course, authoritarian and militaristic. So people argued that this wasn't good for anybody. I don't know if they went so far as to say, hey, they're going to come after us, but they did it in World War I. The Germans started coming after us, started attacking our bases, started sinking our ships. Then also the communists. We have an issue with communism. The Communist Party was actually a popular party in America. It was a political party. It still is a political party in America. The Communist Party had hundreds of thousands of members. And that's just the public members. That doesn't include people who were often referred to as fellow travelers. The fellow travelers are people who were sympathetic to communist and socialist policies. It should be noted very clearly, communism and fascism are polar opposites. Communism is extreme liberalism. Socialism, extreme liberalism. Fascism is extreme conservatism. So fascism is far right-leaning and communism is far left-leaning. Communists and fascists hate each other. Their ideologies are completely opposite from each other. The only thing really they have in similar is there is like some authoritarian dominance, some authoritarian militarism. But as far as actual economic policies and social policies, they're really entirely opposite from each other. So communists, of course, are fearful of the Germans. Communist Party members, people in Russia, or I should actually say USSR, it's technically the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they're very fearful of what fascism is, say that 3 times, of what fascism represents. Um, and so many people do support this idea of communism. And communism was, I mean, I'm not going to say accepted. Don't It wasn't accepted, but there were quite a few communists in America. And remember, World War One, technically, the Soviets were our allies. The Russians were our allies. And even now, in World War II approaching, the communists, we have relations with the communists politically. We're not their enemy exactly. Um, so that's interesting. And supporters, of course, are fearful of this because there is, we have had Red Scare in the 20s. I didn't really talk about it because I'm going to talk about the one in the 50s. But, there was concerns about communism and communist persecution and the fact that we were very trepidatious, is that the right word, about dealing with communism, not our enemy, but not our friend. So, emboldened by the lack of action from Europeans and the Americans, the fascist countries just kept growing and expanding. Germany, Italy, Japan all kept growing, expanding, and kept aggression. Specifically, we'll talk about Germany. Germany annexes Austria in 1938. That's a polite word, annex. The U.S. uses that word all the time. During our imperialistic era, we always would talk about annexing countries. It's a nice word to say. We conquered the country. Annexing country is basically militarily conquering a country and forcing them to obey us, forcing them to live under our authority. Annexation can often be brutal and murderous, and lots of people can die. It's a polite word for conquest. Anyway, they annexed Austria in 38. Then England and France allowed Germany to take Czechoslovakia. They allow them to take Czechoslovakia. Now, does anyone ask Austria or Czechoslovakia what they want from this? No. They simply allow them to do it. Now, why do they do this? They do it because Germany promises take no more land. Germany's argument is simply Austria and Czechoslovakia should be part of our country. You took it away from us. You took the parts away from us in World War One. We simply want them back. You give us back what we say is rightly ours, and we're good. We're good to go. We're done. You give us back what we think's ours, and we're done. They wanted the Sudetenland. They wanted other places as well. Germany pledges to do this. This is what we call appeasement. We kept giving in over and over and over. And it isn't that we're doing it. We're really kind of staying out of this. But European countries keep giving in to the Germans. We were really doing it with Japan and China. We kept letting Japan push us around regarding China because we claimed we were allies and friends of China. And yet we let Japan do terrible things, and we did nothing to stop them. They were willing to do anything. It's really the weird irony here. In essence, by appeasing Germany with the one purpose of avoiding war, we caused the war. It's really that simple. Because if you never stand up to a bully, what's a bully keep doing? He keeps bullying. He keeps getting braver and braver. Bullies more people. If you don't stop a bully from taking your lunch money, guess what? He's going to take other people's lunch money. Then he's going to ask for more and more. So that's what Germany was doing. Then he signs the non-aggression treaty with Russia. There is no purpose whatsoever to do that other than one. What you don't want to do is fight a war on two fronts. You don't want to have to fight Soviet Union this way, England and France this way. So you sign a non-aggression treaty with Germany or with Russia. We're all good. The only purpose of that is to then launch a war the other direction. There's really no other reason. So once the non-aggression treaty is signed with the Soviet Union, I believe that was in 1939, it becomes very obvious what's happening, what's about to happen. Everybody knows it. No one can stop it. Had you stopped Hitler in 1933, maybe you could have stopped it. Had you invaded Germany in 1935, maybe you could have stopped it. Lots of reasons they didn't do that. Obviously, to invade Germany would have caused a war. Might have made you look like the bully. And of course, everybody's in the middle of the Depression. Everyone's in the middle of this terrible depression, and they've got all these economic problems. The last thing they want to do is add another thing onto their plate when everything's already gone to shit. Well, September 1st, Russia invades Poland. September 1st, invades Poland, takes over Poland in just a matter of days with the German Blitzkrieg, the lightning war of their tank army. And 3 days later, England and France declare war on Germany. They finally realized they had to stop them, or try to. War declared just 3 days later, and it was too little too late. In less than a year, Germany/Italy controlled all of Europe, either controlled it or had a treaty with, an alliance type of treaty with all of Europe, except for England. And the only reason England wasn't part of that was because England was an island. Boy, being the island has saved England's ass so many times. From everywhere from Napoleon on, being an island has just saved England so many times. Had Germans been able to get their tanks into England, England would have fallen too. Don't ever try to say that to an English person because there's fighting words. But had Germans been able to get their tanks into England, England would have collapsed as well, undoubtedly. Um, War. Less than a year, Germany has already looked like they've won. They've taken over Europe. They control Europe, hands down. Except for countries that either allied with them or made a non-aggression treaty, like Russia. Pretty bad. Now the U.S. doesn't do the same thing. World War I, we stayed out of the war for almost the whole war. We really only fought in the war for a year, out of over a 4-year war, almost a 5-year war. Well, World War II, initially FDR follows public opinion, which is isolationist. That only lasts for a while, though. Only lasts for a while. Because FDR made it obvious, and he didn't make it obvious publicly, but we know after the fact from his own writings that he wanted to get into the war. He wanted to actually get involved and intervene with Hitler before the war ever started. He already knew it was happening. Again, everybody in the know, everyone in the political circles, in the high levels of government, everyone already knew what was happening or about to happen. So we see more and more people calling up their, basically stepping up and calling for action, believing FDR needs to get involved, but still the majority of America seems to be the public opinion of isolation versus intervention. However, he makes it very clear that he is going to defend America from Germany. He asks Congress to make preparations for war. He starts building military bases. He institutes a draft. He asks for war monies. He does everything to prepare for war, other than declaring war. Um, Whether this was because he knew we were going to get involved, probably that, or simply he wanted to deter Germany from coming after us by showing that we were going to defend ourselves very strongly. And we were very powerful. We were one of the most powerful economies in the world with a large population. We were already one of the world's largest populations. So we would have been again, Germany couldn't even conquer England. And it was this little island right off their coast. Was there any possible way Germany could invade and take over the United States? Absolutely not. This, never. They couldn't even conquer England, which was a little island 50 miles away. So there's no freaking way they could have ever really conquered the United States. But they would have, we wanted to show that. It was probably both. FDR probably wanted to get ready for the war, but also to basically show we were going to defend ourselves. 1940 election happens. While all this is happening, remember, U.S. not in the war. FDR outlines the 4 essential freedoms, and these are directly aimed at Hitler. These 4 essential freedoms are directly aimed at fascism and indicates we will protect the USA at all costs. We're going to spend all kinds of money. We're going to prepare ourselves. He gets reelected, the only president to serve 3 terms. He gets elected for the 3rd term, 1940. The 4 essential freedoms: freedom of speech, not allowed in fascism. Freedom of religion, not allowed in fascism. Freedom from want. Well, if you were a Nazi, you didn't want. But if you were not of the Nazi party, then you wanted, because then you were being left out, then you were oppressed and exploited, and you lived in poverty if you didn't agree to be Nazi. And then, of course, freedom from fear. The whole idea that fascism really instilled fear. They used fear to drive. Again, Hitler was a demagogue. He used fear and prejudices to really fire people up. So fear was what fascism's all about. That's the driving force for people, leaders under fascism. So he declares these 4 freedoms and that we will defend the world for democracy anywhere. He certainly feared what would happen when Europe fell. Not if, but when. Because even by 1940 election, it was pretty obvious Europe had already fallen. So the question was, I suppose the real question wasn't if the U.S. was going to get involved, but when. It was just a matter of when. This gives you an idea. Military bases. You see all these little four little circles with the four parts. These are all military bases. We build military bases all across the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific, all in preparation to deal with German advances, German U-boats, now submarines, and German ships, um, all to prepare ourselves for the oncoming battles or to defend ourselves. We had every intention of defending the Western Hemisphere vociferously. We really don't have to. Germany never really gets over here and comes after us. There's a few isolated skirmishes, and of course, we do have ships sunk. We do lose a lot of ships. But as far as actual land battles in the Americas between Germany, not really. Even Pearl Harbor, yeah, that's an island in the middle of the Pacific. So the war never really comes to us. But we do take the war to them, of course, after Pearl Harbor, which we will talk about now. FDR provoked. FDR provoked Japan. I don't know that it was purposeful provocation, but he criticized Japan. They invaded China. That invasion I talked about. They didn't intervene. We didn't do anything to stop Japan's invasion of China. The Rape of Nanjing, as it was referred to, was the invasion of the Nanjing area, Nanjing province. 300,000 Chinese soldiers and civilian citizens were massacred. Over 80,000 Chinese women were raped purposely by Japanese soldiers. The same way we had racism here in the Western world, this idea of a white master race superior to all others, Japan had the same ideology that they had a superior Asian race, superior to all others, specifically, or at least most importantly, China. That Japan's race was the most pure Asian blood over the Chinese. That's why they raped them, to inseminate them with the more superior Japanese blood. No other response, just criticism, and we did not do anything else. There's a reason for this very clearly. For us to have actually gone in and stopped Japan and China would have involved us getting involved in the war. And we still were wanting to be isolationists and not get involved in the war. We were partly, well, I'm not going to say we're to blame for what Japan did, but it needs to be understood that for all through the 30s, we fueled Japan's economy. We were their number one supplier of oil and fossil fuels, and we purchased a lot of their market and their goods. They purchased our goods. We helped stimulate the Japanese economy. We helped industrialize Japan. Of course, we had no idea they were going to do this, but a lot of Japan's power came from their association with the United States. 1940, General Tojo takes charge. General Hideki Tojo takes control of the Japanese Empire. The invasion of Indochina. Manchuria was northeast China, central China, Nanjing, and then Indochina. That's the southeastern corner where like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Japan invades there. We freeze all of Japanese assets. Again, they were one of our number one trade partners. We freeze their assets in the United States. We shut down trade deals with them. We start to embargo goods. We cut off their oil supply. What's probably the worst part about this is we waited so long. Japan had been attacking and invading China for almost a decade. For years they've been doing this. And now we finally cut off trade with them. It just really shows that what the real bottom line is always profit. It's always about profit. It's always about money. So even though Japan had been militarily aggressive and murderous towards China for years, it wasn't until 1940 that we really put our foot down. You've been killing and murdering people for the better part of a decade. Now we're going to tell you to stop. As a country, we should really be ashamed of how we dealt with this. And of course, it's the government and private business, large corporations. Bottom line has always been money. It always is, still is today. We do eventually cut off most of their oil supply. Tojo goes to the high command, and Tojo, this is the embargo of the oil. Tojo goes to the high command of Japan, however that works, and makes his argument that Japan will run out of fossil fuels in 18 months. So in a year and a half, Japan will run out of the ability to make war. You cannot make war without oil in 1940s. You simply cannot. In modern society, you cannot run a war machine without oil. And he argues that we were run out of oil due to America's embargo. And what the embargo amounted to is the United States had a strong military presence in the Pacific, and we were cutting off oil trade to Japan, stopping the ships and blocking the ships. And we ourselves were stopping the trade with Japan for oil. We were a supplier. And so the solution is simple. They must free the Pacific of the United States. They must get us out of the Pacific, and they must dominate the Pacific to free up the oil supplies, to free up trade, and to otherwise Japan is going to lose any type of a war, any type of a battle. There's no other way to do it. So in essence, Japan argues they're forced to attack us. They must attack us because of our actions. It was a huge mistake. I mean, everyone knows we won, but really at the time, no one knew what was going to happen. This is what woke the sleeping giant. This is really what forced us to get involved with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor, as FDR called it, the day which will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. What made it worse was, you should understand, if you're unclear about this, from the teens, the 20s, and the 30s, Japan was our ally. That's one of the things that made this so heinous in FDR's view. Japan had been our ally, our friend. World War I, Japan was our ally. So the idea that our ally, which had been our friend now for over 20 years, a trade partner, economic partner, etc., now was turning on us. But of course, Japan framed it as we forced them. We forced them to do it. 2,400 Americans die at Pearl Harbor. FDR goes on the radio, day which lives in infamy. He asks Congress to declare war, and Congress does declare war. And we are now in the war after Pearl Harbor, declaring war against Germany and Italy and Japan. This is a photo here of an airfield, Pearl Harbor, the day of, not even the day of, it looks like it's during the attack. This is probably a fuel tank here of some sort that exploded. Japan attacked the airfields. Obviously, they didn't want the American planes getting in the air. Japan actually couldn't reach us. The Pearl Harbor was too far away, so what they did was they had aircraft carriers. They built aircraft carriers. I believe they were, I don't know, we actually might have had an aircraft carrier before them, but they revolutionized the technology to basically make war with an aircraft carrier. They build multiple carriers, go across the Pacific, launch their planes, and the planes are on suicide missions, kamikaze missions. They're told they don't have enough fuel to get back. So after they drop their bombs and their torpedoes and they do their strafing runs to kill or destroy, they are then to do kamikaze runs and to crash their planes into airfields, fuel tanks, ships, to do as much damage to the American fleet as possible. You have to imagine the emotions people had after seeing these types of photos, that they would have seen them in the newspapers and seen them in the movie reels. 2,400 Americans lost their lives. The deadliest single day of American war, if you want to classify 9/11 as war, until September 11th, 2001, the worst day we'd had. The most Americans lost at one time. Early morning hours of December 7th, I think it was a Sunday. They were actually seen on the radar. The radar saw them coming. They believed it was a large flock of birds or a weather disturbance. And the United States government knew there was an attack coming. They had intel saying there was an attack coming. They just didn't know where or when it was coming. And they believed Pearl Harbor was safe because it was too far. The planes simply couldn't reach Pearl Harbor. Well, that's right. The planes could not reach Pearl Harbor unless they sailed across the Pacific in an aircraft carrier, and they were told they would not be able to return. And they also fitted. It was also another thing. Many of the ships were inside, like the harbor, which would have made them hard to target by torpedoes. They outfitted torpedoes with a special contraption that allowed the torpedoes to work in shallow water and destroy the ships. There are still ships at the bottom of the harbor with sailors that were never recovered. Um, all right, financing the war. The War Powers Act of 1941, passed by Congress, gives the president broad powers. Um, this is almost dictatorial powers. He was almost given dictatorial powers. He was given broad range from the U.S. Congress to do anything and everything necessary to fight this war against Germany and against Japan. This mobilized the economy. We call this the war mobilization of the economy. It ends the Depression immediately. Now, we had already come out of the Depression. By 1939, the unemployment rate was down to like 8%, which is still high, but compared to 25. So FDR had already brought us out of the Depression. However, by 1941, our unemployment rate was like 1%. Pretty much everyone who wanted to work could work, and if you wanted 2 jobs, you could work 2 jobs. So, yeah, this totally ends the Depression, completely ends it. By 1943, 2/3 of the entire U.S. economy was war production. 2/3 of the entire economy was producing products for the war effort. Whether it is a tank, gun, or food, doesn't matter, fuel, whatever, producing war products. This happens due to significant government and private industry, this coalition of government and private industry working together. We also get the first income taxes. Income taxes were important to help fund the war effort and help fund the government as it building for war. For the first time, this isn't our first, I should say that differently. This isn't our first income tax. There had been income tax created back in the 30s. This is the first income tax that affected all Americans. Income taxes before this that had existed really only affected the top 5% or businesses. This income tax that occurs during the war affects almost all Americans. Almost everyone has to pay something. But everyone was working. Everybody was making money. The economy exploded. Good way. I mean, it was just a huge boom in the economy. Immediately, everybody went to work producing war goods and war materials. Businesses paid for the war, about half the war, through business taxes and loans. Many businesses, you might think, well, businesses get loans from the government. We actually find many businesses actually giving money, donations to the government, not without strings attached. They knew they were going to get the money back, or they knew the government was to help them build factories. Like they would give money to the government, and then the government would build them a factory that they would often get to keep. The factory was to build war goods, but when the war ended, they got to keep that factory, retool it to something else, and now build cars, for instance, where they were building planes or tanks or jeeps, that kind of stuff. Lots of money was borrowed from wealthy and businesses and other citizens, of course, paying with the war bonds. Civilians for the civilian government workers reaches 4 million for the first time. 4 million people. Now, this is not in uniform. This isn't people. This isn't soldiers. This is 4 million people in suits and ties and dresses working for the government across America. Massive amount. The WPB is created. The War Production Board is created, awards defense contracts. It allocates resources, copper, rubber, oil. And of course, it convinces businesses to convert to military production. Early on, most didn't want to convert. Early on, there was a lot of resistance. Obviously, you have to retool your entire factory. You have to retrain all of your employees. It's a massive investment early. But when they find out that the government is going to help them do it, build factories for them, let them keep the factories. Oh, and by the way, we're going to buy every damn thing you produce, guaranteed by contract. So build us 1 million of them as quickly as you can. Most businesses realized, oh, okay, we can do this. Most businesses willingly converted once they realized the benefits outweighed the drawbacks from it. Most companies benefited dramatically from war production. Many companies became rich and powerful and wealthy and expanded their operations to produce goods for the government that they guaranteed to buy them from them during the war. This was government subsidized industry. And again, when the war ended, they got to keep their factories. Either they continued making war goods or they retooled them to make something else, but they got to keep all that. Henry Kaiser in Southern California, here in Southern California, Los Angeles, Orange County. Henry Kaiser was a contractor who started building ships on a massive scale. I mean, massive. One fourth of all ships produced during the war came off of Kaiser Shipyards on the West Coast between like Long Beach, Orange County, and Los Angeles. This was the beginning of what we often refer to as the military industrial complex, which is this government and private industry coalition working together to benefit the United States, typically producing military goods. Because you know, of course, the number one industry and the number one expenditure of the U.S. government has been for decades national defense. We spend more money on national defense, and we have spent more money on national defense in the last 50 years than all money we have spent from the government on all other things since the revolution. Everything else the government's ever spent money on in 250 years, all combined, is less than what we spent just on national defense in the last 50 years. Um, the amount of money is staggering, the amount of the money that we're talking about here. So this military industrial complex still in place today, incredibly significant and one of the largest employers in the United States even to today. During the war, we built hundreds of thousands of ships, tanks, planes, tens of millions of guns, countless numbers of ammunition and bombs, unbelievable amount. The shipbuilding got so big that Kaiser was rolling. You don't have it in my notes. I don't see it here in my notes. Maybe it's somewhere else. But the Kaiser shipyards, along with other shipyards, were producing like 3 ships, 4 ships every single week. Now, that doesn't mean they built a ship in a week, but they were building so many ships so quickly that they were able to roll 3 or 4 completely finished ships off the shipyards every single week by the early 40s. This revolutionized America's industry, ended the Depression, put everybody to work, and changed our society. We've never really looked back, truly. Ultimately, over 15 million men and women enlist in the military from every part of America, every socio-economic, cultural group, every religion. We have everybody, millions and millions. Now, don't get me wrong, 15 million people didn't fight in this war. Only a couple million actually were directly involved in fighting. But so many people volunteered, and there was a draft. There was a draft, but still millions volunteered. We did not really need to draft anyone. Millions of people volunteered for this. Um, the military was segregated. Black-white segregation was still the case. No one else, Asian, Latinos, everyone else served right alongside whites, but blacks had to still be separate. Um, but all other groups were allowed to serve right alongside whites in white units. Um, we see millions of civilians as well. I didn't even mention that. 15 million enlisted, but we also enlisted 100 million people in the workplace to work in the factories. If you want to use enlisted as that word, we enlisted them to work mobilize. Maybe that's a better word. We mobilized them to work in the workplaces. Um, the NAACP railed against this. They claim that this was a segregationist military, segregationist army. The idea that a Jim Crow army cannot fight for a free world. This, of course, is referencing Jim Crow segregation, discrimination, oppression, all the black codes, all the racism. Uh, we still have dozens of lynchings. These are recorded lynchings every single year. This is really hugely significant. As we'll talk about in the coming chapters, one of the significant causes of the civil rights movement is World War II. For this is a big part of it. The idea that black people are fighting for freedom and equality and liberties around the world, but they still don't get those in the United States, where they're coming from, the country they're fighting for. They're still not treated fairly as equal people. So, um, not a lot of it comes about during the war, but it does have a significant effect after the war. Almost 400,000 enlisted women. They enlisted generally in one of three groups: the WACs, the WAVES, the WASPs. Um, the Women's Army Corps, that's the WACs. About 140,000 women enlisted in the Women's Army Corps. About 100,000 women enlisted in the WAVES. Women accepted for volunteer emergency service. And a lot of these women weren't even paid. They weren't even paid. So 140,000 in the WACs, Women's Army Corps service, WAVES, the Women's Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. We had about 75,000 nurses that volunteered and were paid as well, about 75,000 nurses. And then you have the WASPs, which was a very unique and elite group. The Women's Air Force service pilots were female pilots. Very few of them, less than 1,000, around 1,000. These women served as pilots in safe zones. They didn't fly combat missions. They were basically transport of goods and troops and materials. They weren't assigned to combat duty. This is generally for all women. No command, no combat duty. The jobs they did were the quote unquote women's work: clerical, service, any type of desk work, anything that a woman would not be on the front lines, paperwork, stuff like this, working phones, communication. We see a few women in intelligence services, intelligence work, but that again, office intelligence, not like a spy in the field. Um, no command duties. It was common. I saw women write about this, that they would outrank male enlisted people or male soldiers, and the male soldiers wouldn't obey their orders, and there was no repercussions for doing that. They didn't get in trouble for it. Women did not fight on the combat lines, but we still had hundreds of thousands that fought, and we had several that did die. Most notably, Pearl Harbor. Dozens of women were killed in Pearl Harbor, nurses, for instance. So women did fight and die for the cause, and they would have done more, undoubtedly, had they been allowed to. Here we see women back home. Probably the biggest significant contribution women made during the war was when they stayed home and they filled in for all the men doing all the jobs while the men were gone. Of that 15 million, almost all those were men. So someone had to do those jobs. The jobs were there. Now that the war had begun, now that the factories were all fired up and rolling, someone needed to be working. So the women filled in and did the works. They were often known as Rosies. They were called Rosies, from like a Norman Rockwell painting, I think. And these Rosies would do all these jobs that normally would have been male jobs, working in factories, building ships. These are women working in a tail section of a plane. They're putting together the fuselage of the plane and riveting and drilling and doing all the parts. They dressed like men. They worked in these male factories. The supervisors, managers were probably still men. Um, they made bombs, tanks, planes, and of course they worked in all the other factories, doing all the other stuff too. This was sort of propaganda by the government because the jobs were there, the things needed to be made. They needed people doing it, so they needed the women to leave the home, leave their family, stop being a housewife, and go out and work. The government wanted all women to work. They wanted everybody to work. There were jobs for everyone. Most factories were 24 hours, 24/7. They ran around the clock shifts. So whatever time you could work, if you would like leave your kids in bed at home, and then you would go to the factory for a few hours, 6 hours at night where the kids were sleeping, whatever. Everyone was supposed to work, everyone who could, and millions of women. 1/3 of the entire workforce in the United States, almost 1/3 of the entire workforce became female. This is the highest percentage of women working in the workforce, I, until modern times, really until much more recent, until the last 20, 30 years. Uh, it was hugely impactful, these Rosies, hugely impactful. And it's probably really was good for them too. Many of them, it gave them independence, gave them freedom, gave them money in their pocket. They were taking care of the families. They were feeling they were doing their part. They were supporting the war effort. They were building bullets to put in the rifles their husbands were using to fight the Germans. So, really important, really impactful. Lots of changes at home. Unemployment drops to basically nothing, um, almost nothing. We see large numbers of minorities, blacks, Asian, Latinos, women into the workforce. We see wages increase, and we generally consider workplace improvements. Generally speaking, everything went up. More money, more opportunity, better treatment, less racism and prejudice. We see most of that improve, generally speaking. Around the Rosie the Riveter was the women. This was this sort of this defense industry propaganda to get women out there to work and take care of the war effort and help the war effort to entice them into factories. Many women left their traditional roles in lower paying jobs, part-time jobs, as housewives, as daughters, in college, and they would go and join the workforce. Hundreds of thousands of women involved in nursing, again, 75,000 in the war, but even back home, you still have nurses all across the country, coast to coast. They saw better paying work, better opportunities, um, ship welders, riveters, drill press operators. And as I said, one third of the entire labor force were women by the end of the war, the largest number until modern times. They did, of course, face constant sexual harassment, poor pay. Pays better, I just said, you bet, but it's still less than men, much less than men. So they're making more money than they did, but significantly less than the man who had just been doing that same job the week before. Conditions were rough: discrimination, harassment, sexual exploitation. Um, definitely rough, but better. Generally speaking, better opportunities for women, more freedom, more opportunity, more independence. However, when the war ended, the expectations were very clear. You were to put down your drill press. I don't guess you probably pick up a drill press. Maybe that's something really big. I don't know. Never operated one. You put down your riveting gun. You put it down, go back home, put your dress back on, and be a housewife. That was what you were expected to do. Definitely very sexist. But the idea was the women working during the war, all you were doing was filling in for your husbands while they were gone. Once the husbands came back, you were to give them their job back, very clearly. Should be noted, though, a lot of women didn't. Because there were so many more jobs created during World War II, and most of those jobs hang around after the war. We actually see a sustained economic boom after World War II for years, decades, really. Those jobs don't go away, which means while some women do go back to being housewives, many women actually stay in the workforce. And the men come back, and there are jobs available for everybody. It isn't quite that perfect, but many women who go to work during the war do not leave the job. They will continue working and they'll continue. They may not necessarily be a drill press operator anymore. Many of them might have to give that job up for a man, but they had got this taste of independence, freedom, and equality that many of them had never had before, and so they were unwilling to walk away. Many of them were. What about politics in the war here? Well, in 1944, FDR in his State of the Union proposed a second Bill of Rights. This was leading up to his 1944 election. He was going to be running for president for a fourth time. In his second Bill of Rights, he called for some guarantees. Guarantees of food for all. Guaranteed. No one will ever starve. The government will take care of it. Everyone has a right to clothing and be clothed. Everyone has a right to housing. Everyone has a right to medical care for all. Everyone has a right. Basically, these were classified as civil rights. Everyone has the civil right that the government will guarantee for food, clothing, housing, medical care, jobs, education, and more. Had he passed this, had he actually done this, America would have potentially, we could have considered ourselves a socialist democracy. These are things that are provided by social democracies today. The U.S. is not a social democracy, even though we have a massive welfare system. We do not guarantee many of the basic necessities of life. We do not guarantee everybody a home. I mean, look at the homelessness. Look how many people are homeless. California has almost 100,000 homeless people. We are far, and again, California is one of the most liberal states. We're far from guaranteeing homes for everybody. So this idea of guaranteeing all these things would have been dramatic expansion of the New Deal. It would have been doubling down on the New Deal, making it much bigger and expanding it to every single American in every way. Congress said no. Congress said, we're not going to do that. We can't do that. That is simply too much, too far. And of course, some of this probably ties into our nervousness about socialism and communism because we were really nervous about communism and socialism. So much of this was simply too much. FDR had gotten away with doing much of what many of these types of things during the Depression because America was literally dying. Uh, Now we're not. Now everybody's working. Everybody has a job. All the factories are running 24/7, 365. Nobody is wanting. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure there's still some homeless people on the street. I'm sure there's unemployment of a very, very low number. But 99% of Americans are getting everything they need, everything they could want. Everyone's being productive, and Congress says there's no need for this. Anyone who wants this stuff has this stuff. Not a lot of foresight on Congress's mind there, but nonetheless, it's hard to plan for disaster when everything is perfect. Hard to do that. However, Congress does pass all of these things for the military men. As a reward for the military men and women going and fighting fascism around the world and fighting for freedom and democracy, they passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, often called the GI Bill of Rights. The GI is what they often refer to the soldiers. GI meaning government issue. Basically, the soldier is a government issue, almost like he's a product, almost like he's a thing. They train him, they create him, and they send him off around the world to fight for freedom and democracy. So the Servicemen's Readjustment Act does guarantee almost all these things for returning servicemen. Free education, guarantee of job training, you get free medical care for life. They'll house you while you're there. They'll house your family while you're in the military. They'll give you housing assistance. Of course, they pay for your clothing. They give you allowances for food and clothing and housing. It isn't exactly all socialist policy, but generally speaking, if you're a soldier, the government's going to take care of you during and after the war, you and your family. Wonderful. The GI Bill is an incredible thing that is still used by millions of soldiers today. It's a wonderful thing. It would have been nice if all this had been guaranteed to all Americans. However, it could also be argued it might have bankrupted our economy. This would have been to do all these things FDR suggested would have been incredibly expensive. So, didn't happen. The election of 1944, they choose Harry Truman as VP. What's special about Harry Truman? He was basically a nobody before this. What did they do? Harry Truman was an outspoken supporter of FDR. Most of his policies, most of his worldviews, his ideologies mirrored FDR's ideologies. Very similar to FDR in his political views. That's why they chose him. FDR had been sick for a couple years. I mean, obviously, you knew he had polio from 1921, but he had actually been sick for the last couple years and medical treatments in and out of the hospital. His illness was flaring up. Many people in his inner circle didn't think he had long. They didn't know how much longer. And of course, throw on top of that the stress and the pressure, the depression and the war. Frankly, that's enough to kill a healthy man, not someone who already has an underlying disease. They chose him. FDR runs for the election with Truman as VP. FDR wins. 54% of the popular vote, a very strong election, wins almost every state. He wins the fourth term as president with FDR as VP. Obviously, very significant because we know what happens to FDR soon. All right. So at home, life on the home front. This is at home. So we've talked about the industry, the economics. Let's talk about culturally what it was to live in America. We're not talking about the factory, but like what it was to live culturally and socially in America during the worst war that has ever plagued the earth. Um, well, the idea was for the duration. This is what often came out of the movie industry was that this was for the duration. As long as it lasts, however long the war takes, we will fight. And this is why we fight. This is why we're fighting. We will fight as long as necessary for the duration. However long our boys are over there, we'll fight. The government created a new office, a new department known as OWI, the Office of War Information, with ads. In essence, it was propaganda showing why you're doing it, why you're sacrificing, why you're rationing food and supplies, why are you working 16 hours a day, why is your father and your brother and your son and your husband gone to the other side of the world. It is really to keep up morale, why we're doing it. This Office of War Information, also to keep people apprised of the progress of the war, of course. And ultimately, it was all good. It was good for the people, good for the family, good for your husbands, brothers, fathers, good for the country. It is good for America. Everything we're doing, whether you're in uniform or not, is all for the greater good of our country. Movies and other culture and media and entertainment and posters and advertisements, radio, everything. Anything you classify as media was focused on the fact that we need to keep doing it for as long as we need the duration, and we continue supporting our boys in uniform no matter what, whatever is necessary. Hollywood directly worked with the government during this. We see a large number of war movies produced in the 1940s. The hero of the movies became the war hero, the soldier that would fight and kill the Nazis and kill the Japanese and win victory for Americans. Um, these Why We Fight documentaries produced by Hollywood to explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, and to boost morale. These became very popular. People like John Wayne, if you've ever heard of John Wayne, lots of other war heroes as well. Theaters also ran all night for the first time. We see 24-hour theaters to match the 24-hour factories. You get off work at 3 in the morning, go to the movie theater. Two purposes. One, for entertainment, obviously. You're stressed. I mean, it's a world war. People are dying. It's dramatic. Even though it isn't being fought in America on American land, it is still a day in and day out stressful situation. So people need to relax. People need relief. People need time out. But also, if you remember mentioning before, in the middle of the movie reels, because back then they actually had to change movie reels every time, every 30, 40 minutes, they had to take the reel off and put a new one on. When they were doing that, they would put on newsreels, which were like 5 or 10 minutes, basically news commercials, and they would give you all the news. So you would watch a movie, you would have a newsreel in between the different movie reels, and it would show you about the war, these documentaries. It would give you all of the stuff telling you why we're doing this, why we are doing all of this. Consumer goods, lots of shortages. Here's the interesting thing: people had more money, but they couldn't spend it, which ultimately was good. Because in the long run, that saving of the money really allows people to truly invest it and use it in a very profitable and useful way when the war ends. Because our economy just goes straight up once the war is over. But you can't really spend the money during the war because everything's rationed. Plus, 2/3 of all products being made are war goods. You can't eat bullets. You can't drink a rifle. So most of the goods being produced in the factories, you simply are useless to us. They're made for the war effort. So you weren't supposed to drive your car. Thousands, tens of thousands of people actually jacked their cars up on bricks and took their tires off, stripped their car of everything that could be used. You donate the rubber. You donated your shoes. You were supposed to not really just have like one pair of shoes. You shouldn't buy new shoes. You should repair your stuff. Um, anytime you could do anything to keep from using a product that wasn't for the war effort, you should do that. You had to ration meat, you had to ration butter, you had to ration, women had to ration their nylons. I mean, literally everything had to be rationed. You actually were given these cards. You had these ration cards, which would say you get like one block of butter this week or something like that. So you shouldn't be using fuel. You shouldn't be doing a lot of leisure stuff. Now and then you have to unwind to watch a movie or something, but you shouldn't be wasting any resources. Every resource should be going towards the war effort. We had regulations on everything. Almost everything was regulated by the government to what you could use or couldn't use or how much you could use. Black market was huge. Cigarettes and gasoline. Cigarettes and gasoline was these things you could buy on the black market illegally. Alcohol was also something you shouldn't really be using alcohol. That was a big black market good as well. Um, People made more money. They had more money, and then they couldn't spend it on anything, which ultimately was good for our economy in the long run. During the war, the government's supporting the economy. When the war ends, when the government stops doing that, all the people that have all this money start putting their money into the economy, buying cars, buying homes, buying things, which really makes the economy just go up. It worked out well. It worked out really well, ultimately. Uh, but during the war, you had to really sacrifice. Whether you were literally putting your life on the line in uniform, or whether you were back home having to sacrifice on a daily basis for so many goods, just the way it was. These two images would be an excellent discussion question. Um, I'm not going into detail on them because you can obviously pause and look at them. Look at these two images and think about what was the significance of these advertisements for the government. What is the purpose? What are people supposed to? I guess the best way to say it is should they feel about this? When you see this type of imagery, make sure you look at the entire image. When you see this type of imagery, what should you think? Now, these are two totally different things. Don't misconstrue that these are supposed to give you the same ideas. They're not. But looking at these two, what types of things is the government trying to instill in people? What are the ideas they want people to think or feel, and what do they want people to what actions do they want Americans to take? Like, what kind of emotions should these types of images and these messages elicit in you? And this should, of course, all directly pertains to the war and the war effort. Something to think about. Be a good discussion question. All right, let's move to the next thing. One of the worst things that happened during this war was Japanese internment, um, Japanese war removal. In World War One, our attacks were mostly on Germans and Italians, because at the beginning of World War One, Germany and Italy were both our enemies. Well, a large number of American population is related to Germany. Again, 40% of Americans can relate their ancestry to Germany. So lots of Italians, lots of Germans. But of course, they didn't attack us directly, did they? But the Japanese did. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So the focus of America's ire and racism and prejudice was on the Japanese. Many people on the West Coast really started to fear Japanese, in essence, the idea of Japanese further attacks. After Pearl Harbor occurs, people start looking around and seeing Japanese people around, Asian people around. And if you know the West Coast, which I've already sort of talked about, California already had a long history of anti-Asian discrimination and racism. So you combine this with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and anti-Asian sentiment just goes through the roof. This fear and this hatred of Asian and Japanese peoples. Even though there were very, very few Japanese people, Japanese or Japanese Americans on the West Coast, and they had literally no power whatsoever, no political or economic power. They were no way whatsoever able to really cripple our economy or hurt us in any way. So this was certainly unfounded fears. The president, though, buys into it. The president buys into the pressure from Congress. He issues an executive order, 9066. 9066, issued by him, which authorizes the War Department. Today we say the Department of Defense, back then the War Department. Authorizes the War Department to force Japanese and Japanese Americans into relocation camps. And most of these were Japanese Americans. Most of these were American-born citizens. Their civil rights were violated 3 ways to Sunday. I mean, just a whole list of civil liberties violated by this whole Japanese relocation. Didn't matter at the time. Didn't matter. Probably the most dangerous thing in the world is what? Fear. Fear. And they feared. They feared what Japanese represented. And the president went right along with it. Most were Japanese Americans, American-born citizens. The War Department creates the War Relocation Authority, which then creates internment camps. They create about 9 of these, internment camps. The War Relocation Authority then moves everybody who is thought to be Japanese or Japanese Americans to these camps. They lose everything. They lose their jobs, they lose their businesses, they lose their cars, they lose their homes, all of it. In many cases, they were given 48 hours notice. A sign was posted on their door that said 48 hours, you were to have whatever you can carry, standing on the curb, waiting to be picked up and moved for the safety of America. We have the authority by the President and Congress to relocate you, and we will do it forcibly if necessary. The only exceptions to this was if you were a student, an agricultural worker, or you were willing to enlist in the military. I guess then they could keep an eye on you. Or you proved your loyalty by taking the oath, swearing the oath. Farm worker, of course, was an exception because they needed agricultural products, and Japanese Americans were a large percentage of the agricultural farm workers on the West Coast. And if you were a student, I don't know. If you were a student, I guess they thought you were safe. Not really sure. Some people do resist. Some do. Gordon Hirabayashi is an example. He was a pacifist. He was a student at the University of Washington. He was a pacifist. He was a CO, registered as a conscientious objector, meaning he conscientiously objected to violence and warfare. He left school, though. Once he left school, he was no longer an exception, which meant he was forced to relocate. He refused to do. He refused to relocate. The FBI issued a warrant for him, his arrest, and he turned himself into the FBI. He was arrested and thrown in jail for failing to relocate as ordered. He sued the government. He said his rights were violated in every way. He was an American citizen, his civil liberties, and of course he was entirely correct. Everything that was done with this whole war relocation was violations of the first 10 amendments, our Bill of Rights. There's multiple places in there, very clear. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a very odd ruling, says, we generally agree with you, Mr. Hirabayashi. However, it's okay to do it. It's a military necessity because of war. So even though, generally speaking, your argument is valid, it doesn't matter because we're at war, and the rules of society must be suspended if necessary because it is a military necessity to protect us from the Japanese. After years and years of lobbying in Congress, finally, 40 years later, Congress issues an apology. Very half-hearted apology. But finally, it's issued in 1988, and they offer $20,000 to survivors, to the ones who are still surviving. You have to wonder what that really meant. $20,000 is nothing, really, for what happened. When you consider people lost their homes, their jobs, their careers, their businesses, they lost everything. And rarely did anyone get that stuff back. I mean, by the time they return, the car is already sold. The house is sold. You can't blame the person living there now. They bought their house fair and square, so it's their house. You can't make them give it up. I mean, they paid for it. So who's to blame? Really, the government. It's only the government. But the government was unwilling until the 1980s to even admit they'd done anything wrong, even though this was one of the greatest breaches of American civil liberties in the history of our country. Nonetheless, it happened. and most never got anything back. So my point of that was you have to wonder what was worse, the 20,000, which was very small, although it is still $20,000, or was it actually good for Japanese Americans because the government did apologize and say we were wrong, we made a mistake, this should never have happened. I don't know. I really don't know. Um, Nonetheless, it happened, and it took the government over 40 years to admit it had made a mistake. This gives you an idea of some of the relocation plans. I've been to Manzanar. It's in the middle of the desert. It is a very inhospitable place, and you would never want to live there. Um, Tule Lake. I went to Tule Lake, but it was closed, unfortunately, so I didn't get to go in there. So you see these relocation. All these orange areas is where military exclusion zone. If you were Japanese, you couldn't live in this dark orange area, orangish pink, whatever it is. And then these areas that were light pink is where most Japanese people lived in America. Not many. There was not a large population at all. If you could actually get a family member somewhere back east to vouch for you, or another person to vouch for you who wasn't Japanese, you could simply pack up from the West Coast and go out here and say you could move in with someone in Missouri. That was okay. They simply didn't want you on the West Coast. If you were unwilling to, you were moved to these temporary relocation camps, and you lived there. The average internment was only about a year and a half. That's still a year and a half of your entire life destroyed, and you got to come back and try to put it all back together. But the average internment was about 18 months, 16, 18 months. And they were actually not bad. They were not, you cannot in any way compare these to like prison camps or concentration camps. Nobody was ever shot or killed in any of the camps. People died, but just have died of natural causes. No one was shot, killed, starved, murdered, tortured. None of that happened. But it's still violations of all their civil liberties. I mean, does someone have the right to knock on your door and basically pack you up and move you off to some outside prison camp for the next 2 years? No, they don't. Nonetheless, they were allowed to have homes, churches, schools, shops. They were basically like a little town, although surrounded by barbed wire with soldiers pointing guns at them if they tried to leave. Uh, Certainly a sad day in American history, this kind of action that was taken. All right, so let's get back to the war. FDR and Churchill and Stalin, often known as the Big Three. This is the leader of America, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill of England, and Stalin of the USSR. These were the Big Three. They agreed, generally speaking, that that together they had their military strategy had to be to defeat Germany, and then once they defeated Germany, they would go for Japan. This is where their agreement stopped. This is one of the big problems. They all agreed Germany had to go first and Japan was next, but no one could agree when to do it, how to do it, the strategy to use, where to attack, who should lead, who should follow. It was a huge mess, and it took years. It took years for people to really, for these leaders to really come to agreement on how to do this. Meanwhile, millions of people are dying. Millions are dying. Up to this time, almost all the fighting had actually been done between Russia and Germany. Most fatalities had been between Russia and Germany. And I use the term Russia. I understand I'm referring to the USSR, which is far more than Russia, but I just usually say Russia. Just understand when I say that I'm meaning USSR. England opposed an invasion in 42. Russia wanted an invasion in 42. England opposes an invasion in 43. Russia wants an invasion in 43. So the whole time that England and America are standing off and holding back and trying to build up and trying to prepare for war years, Russia is on the front lines, millions of their people fighting and dying every year against the Germans. Wait, Russia, didn't they make a treaty with Russia? Yeah, they did. They had that non-aggression treaty back in 39. As soon as Germany took over the rest of Europe, they attacked Russia. The non-aggression treaty lasted a year. It was sole purpose so Germany could uncontested roll over the rest of Europe, and then they went after the only real power left in Europe to fight them, which was the Soviet Union. and they spend the whole rest of the war fighting the Soviets. Um, Great example, 1943, the Battle of Kursk alone, one city, the city of Kursk, the battle to take and control that city, 1 million casualties. One battle. Um, Now, casualties isn't all dead. Casualties is dead and injured. It is amazing. It's one single battle over one single city, 1 million casualties. That just shows you how catastrophic this war was. I mean, there have been countless wars in the history of the world that the entire war that would last for years, and there weren't 1 million casualties. This was one battle over one city, 1 million casualties. Crazy, frankly crazy. Yeah. Finally, there's an agreement reached in 1944 for an invasion to where everybody would get together and invade Germany from the west, while Russia continues to hold off Germany from the east. This, of course, left Stalin angry, suspicious, upset. Stalin was. This is one of the causes of the Cold War. The way Russia was treated during the entirety of World War II. They were treated as, even though they were technically an ally, they weren't really given assistance. They are the ones who did the most dying. The most deaths in World War II were Soviets. Those are the number one casualties. And he lost millions of soldiers, and he simply believed that he never was treated properly, his soldiers never treated properly and given proper respect. And after everything they sacrificed, as we'll talk about in a minute, when they got to the end, the Soviet Union almost won this war single-handedly. As a matter of fact, they probably would have. If we had not got involved, the Soviets would have probably beat the Germans by themselves. Probably. So, this idea of us coming in and saving the day at the very last minute and proclaiming ourselves the heroes and we won the war, which is exactly what we did, well, let's just say that pissed off the Soviets to no end. So a lot of what happened during the war in the way we treated the Soviet Union, who was our ally, who was supposed to be our partner, really helped create the Cold War. Certainly did. So war moves to Italy, war moves to Northern Africa. In this intervening 2 years, from 42 to 44, before the big invasion of D-Day, we see another strategy emerge. We fight Northern Africa and try to defeat the Germans in Northern Africa. We do eventually. And then the idea was to actually attack what they would call the soft underbelly of Europe, to in essence invade Italy, to go up the Italian peninsula, and then to invade Germany from below, while the Soviets were keeping them busy from the east. This strategy is partly successful. We do conquer Northern Africa. We cut off a lot of their supply lines. Northern Africa had gold and oil supplies. We take over the Mediterranean, us and England and France and many other countries. This is global. 1 million Indian soldiers, for instance, from India served in the military for the British. This is part of the British Empire. 1 million Australians served for the British. This was global. I'm only mentioning the big countries, but understand it really affected everybody. And so we do conquer Northern Africa, but the invasion of Italy stalls. They can't really win through Italy. They try. Eisenhower and Patton are two of the generals leading this invasion through Northern Africa into Southern Europe. Partially successful, but they're never really able to conquer Italy to get to Germany. They take part of the country, but they're not able to do it. And the German general Rommel, who is thought to have been a brilliant tactician, overwhelmed, outnumbered, single-handedly, almost fought off half a dozen other countries in Northern Africa. Eventually, simply overwhelmed by numbers. The U.S. was simply producing too many tanks, too many planes, too many bombs, and the Germans were literally fighting every direction now. They were bombing England in the north. They were fighting in the west. They were fighting in the south. They were fighting the Soviets in the east. They were fighting in Southeast Asia. They were fighting in Africa. They were fighting in the Pacific, in the Atlantic. The Germans were trying to fight everywhere against a dozen industrialized countries. And the Germans were pretty much the powerhouse behind the war, at least except in Japan. And so eventually it does fall. But the overall invasion of Europe fails going up through Italy, even though they try. Um, Now we're going to move to the actual invasion of D-Day, which, by the way, if you look this up, no one knows what D-Day means. Crazy thing, isn't it? There are a dozen different arguments about what D actually stands for. I'm not going to get into it here. I think it's really interesting that this is the terminology we use for June 6, 44 D-Day, and all the experts cannot agree what D actually stands for. It's quite interesting. Just an odd bit of trivia. The invasion of France on Normandy Beach. This was one of 7 beaches. We actually invaded 7 different beaches. I don't know why Normandy gets all the credit as the most significant one. I don't know. Maybe that's where the American troops went. Not necessarily sure, but the invasion finally comes, led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, General Eisenhower. Terrible casualties, but we took the beach. If you ever watched Saving Private Ryan, that beginning like 30 minutes of just the disaster that happens on the beach where soldiers are literally just being blown apart, it's incredibly graphic and incredibly real. Incredibly real. Um, the beach is captured after several days, along with other beaches. In just the first week, we land over 2 million troops. That's just US. That doesn't include other countries. Indian and Australia and British and other soldiers. Supplies, millions of supplies, of tons of supplies and weapons. It happened fast after this. After we finally showed up, after the Americans we'd spent years building up and preparing, when we finally landed, it was it was fast. We landed in the midsummer. By August, the end of the summer, we had already retaken Paris. We'd already taken most of France. They kept moving inland. By 1944, we were already going through Belgium. You have France, then you have this little country of Belgium, and then you have Germany. So we took over France, took over Belgium, and by the end of 44, just 6 months after the invasion, we were already invading Germany and going into Germany. Germans couldn't stop us. They tried. Their last great offensive was the Battle of the Bulge, where they attempted their last attack against the Allied forces. It failed. It didn't matter if it had been successful. More people would have died, so that would have been bad. But even if the Germans had managed to stop the Allied invasion, they would have most likely, the Allies, you got to understand, by 1945, we had almost 10 million soldiers, either trained or in the process of being trained. The war was over. It was just a matter of how long before the Germans surrendered. There was zero chance, short of some crazy, unpredictable event, there was zero chance of the Germans winning this war come 1945. But nonetheless, they still kept fighting. The Battle of the Bulge they lost. This was around Belgium. The Allies keep advancing forward, the British, the Americans, and other countries. Meanwhile, on the east, the Russians are now advancing. Because the Germans saw what was happening, they diverted a lot of their forces to stop the Allied advance through France and Belgium. That left their eastern side weak, and the Russians just started rolling through the eastern defenses. April, we get into Germany. April 30th, the Allies surround Berlin. April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide. And a week later, Germany surrenders. The war ends. Now, the war isn't over because Japan has not surrendered. The war in Europe is over. And that, of course, was the major thing. Once Germany surrendered, it was just a matter of time before Japan was defeated. We just had to, again, get Japan to surrender. Much different here with Germany in this time period. In World War I, literally the same week we rolled across the German border, the Germans surrendered. Almost immediately. We never got anywhere near Berlin. World War II, we had to actually surround Berlin, cut off the supplies, cut the train lines, bomb Berlin, and even a week after their great leader has already killed himself, it still takes another week before the Germans are willing to surrender. The German High Command, as they called it, the Nazi High Command. One of the most important aspects of this, and most significant aspects of this in 1945, was that we had to defeat the Soviets. We weren't fighting the Soviets. What do you mean? We had to get to Germany first. The race in the last 3 months of this war was not to defeat the Germans. The last 3 months of this war, the race was to get there before the Soviets did, because we wanted to claim victory, that we had defeated the Germans and not the Soviets. We didn't want the Soviet Union to be able to get there, take over Berlin, claim victory, capture Hitler, something like that. No one knew he was going to commit suicide, of course. No one wanted the Soviets to win the war. However, it can be very clearly, looking back on it, that even if the US had not gotten involved in this, most likely the Soviets would have won. By 1945, the Soviets had 8 times more soldiers than the Germans. The Soviet Union's population was massive. It was one of the largest countries in the world. The Germans would have simply ran out of soldiers, while the Soviets would have still had millions. Um, and the Soviets, by the end of the war, had built up a massive. They did the same thing we did. They redirected their entire economy to war production. So in 1945, the Soviets were making almost as many goods as we were. They had thousands of factories producing military goods. We were really in competition with the Soviets before the war even ended, to claim dominance in Europe. Didn't work out very well. Well, as we rolled across Europe, we started opening up all these prison camps, all these extermination camps, these work labor camps. We discovered over 6 million Jewish people that were in these camps, and another 6 million Jewish people that we believed had been killed and executed, murdered, tortured, experimented on, along with millions of others. Slavs, gays, blacks, gypsies, Polish people, anyone from Eastern Europe, Russians. We think maybe as many as 6 million Soviets died in the prison camps. So it was a disaster. Half of that 50 million dead are people that probably died in prison camps, extermination camps, prisoner camps, work labor camps. Just it's unbelievable. It's the Holocaust. The Holocaust often, of course, focuses on Jewish people. The Holocaust, though, was much greater than just Jewish people. Just as many others and Soviets were also murdered and executed, defenseless in prison camps by the Germans. The Holocaust was a massive tragedy against Jews, against Soviets, and against all of the others that the Germans considered inferior to their master race, the undesirables. The imagery that came out of this as we really started to open up these camps, and as reporters would take photos and they would get back to the newspapers and get back to the media, shocked the world. People were just amazed that this was going on. The thing is, we know after the fact that our government knew about it. Not extensively. We didn't know exactly what was happening. But there had been escapes from prison camps. There had been, both sides had spies. We had spies in the German high command. We even had assassination attempts, too, on Hitler's life, or almost assassination attempts. So we had knowledge of these prison and extermination camps. We never did anything. Now, what could we do? Really, the only thing that could have been done would have been to move up our invasion plans, to invade earlier, because we actually know most of these exterminations didn't occur towards the end of the war. First couple years of the war, what the Germans did was they moved and relocated all the Jewish and others. There was not mass execution in 40 and 41. The extermination camps don't really come about till the last couple years of the war. They're part of Hitler's what's called his final plan, or his ultimate plan, or something like that, to kill everyone who is not part of the German master race. Literally exterminate every other being that is not part of Hitler's master German race, to kill them all. Had we invaded Germany in 43 or 42, millions of lives would have been saved. However, far more Americans would have died. This is simply an issue of self-preservation for our country. We saved American lives while sacrificing millions of other lives. We know anti-Semitism was rampant and common in England and America. We know this is basically dislike, distrust, or even hatred of Jewish populations. We don't nearly have the time here to go into that, but we know anti-Semitism was common and rampant in America and France and England, all three countries that were the driving force behind the Allies versus the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. But we knew this stuff was going on. We knew there was things like this happening, these extermination camps, and we did nothing about it. For knowledge that had we done this, we would have lost far more American lives. This gives you an idea of the war in 41-43. Green and blue is the enemy. So you can see in this image very clearly the axis. That is the axis that is Germany or German-occupied lands, either people that are treaties or allied with Germany, control all of Europe and all of Northern Africa. The Allies, our side, are the pink, which is the Soviet Union, our allies in the Middle East, Egypt, and of course England. And then the ones that are yellowish are proclaimed neutral countries. Now we go to 440-445 towards the end of the war. Germany's power has shrunk dramatically. The Soviet Union has advanced. Look at the difference. All of this was German. Look at this now. The Soviet Union has constantly been advancing. Given another 2 or 3 years, the Soviets would have made it all the way to Germany, probably. We believe the Soviet Union would have probably won this war had we never gotten involved eventually. Although the losses to the Soviet Union would have been catastrophic. But we had taken over all of Northern Africa, the Middle East, and we were invading. You see all the blue lines, they're coming from every direction. We had invasions from every direction. We had air attacks. We had Western, Eastern, Southern. By 1945, even by 1944, Germany had already lost. It was just a matter of getting them to surrender and how many more people had to die. And as a result, millions do die because Germany will not surrender. So millions more do die as we move. This is a photograph from soldiers getting off a troop transport heading towards the beach at Normandy. I don't see any bullets flying here. You can see the smoke grenades, probably the smoke from the shelling to sort of mask the soldiers. But the Germans had years to build up weapon emplacements, to build up barricades, to put barbed wire, to put landmines down. Tens of thousands of soldiers died in these couple of days just trying to take these beaches that the Germans had had at least 4 years to put defenses on. It was pretty dramatic. There are some soldiers, not soldiers, these are some inmates being taken out of a prison camp. The living dead, these men are alive, but barely. Look at the man here. See his hands are black? That's not dirt. That is frostbite. His hands are dead. That will turn into gangrene, and all bets say that once he gets back home or to medical treatment, assuming he lives, he will have both his arms amputated to stop the infection of the gangrene because his hands are dead. They're frozen. The flesh is already dead. It's just a matter of trying to save his life. The atrocities the Germans committed in the extermination camps have never really been matched any time since. We've had terrible atrocities committed, especially in the Middle East in the last 10, 20 years. Russians, Syrians, terrible things that have happened in the Middle East in the last 20, 30 years. But none of it really compares to what the Germans did at the end of World War II. Well, what about Japan? What about Japan? Germany has surrendered now and been defeated. We now have to look at the war in the Pacific. Through May of 42, that is the Pearl Harbor was December of 41. So for the next 6 months, the Japanese dominated and controlled the Pacific, defeating America's forces, taking islands all across the Pacific. The Navy did not fare well. We were crippled at Pearl Harbor, although many of the ships were actually out on maneuvers at Pearl Harbor, so we actually saved over half of our fleet that didn't get injured. We would have been in far worse shape had the entire fleet been docked at Pearl Harbor. The death toll would have probably been much greater, and we would have lost a lot more ships. So we do have massive troop and ship losses. The Japan stores across the entirety of Southeast Asia and across the Pacific, almost uncontested. However, two very important victories sort of turned it all around. The Battle of Coral Sea in 42, Japan was invading into Australia. Australia, full of natural resources, gold and oil. Had Japan managed to take over Australia, it would have been incredibly difficult to get them out of the continent. Again, Australia is an entire continent, it's massive. Had Japan managed to get a foothold in Australia, we would have had an incredibly hard time getting them out of there. We stopped them at the Coral Sea, along with the assistance of the Australians and the British. Then in the North Atlantic, we had the Battle of Midway, which was a massive aircraft carrier battle. Although here's an odd thing about it. While it was aircraft carriers, most of the actual fighting was done by the planes. So it was an aerial battle over the ocean in the middle of the Pacific Ocean by planes in the Battle of Midway. We stopped their advance in Australia. We stopped their advance in northern Pacific using lots of bombers and destroyers to destroy their ships, their aircraft carriers. And by 1945, the entire Japanese Navy was defeated. This probably was heavily impacted by what Kaiser Shipyards did and other shipyards. Remember, by the mid 1940s, we were putting 3 ships a week off of the shipyards into the waters. We had a massive navy. By the end of the war, we had the largest navy in the world. So, and we were building that specifically, really, to fight the Japanese, the Germans too, but really the Japanese. Victory was in sight. Then in April of 45, he dies. FDR dies, I believe, of a coronary, I may be corrected, of a brain hemorrhage, complicated by pneumonia and his polio. He passes, and Harry Truman takes over as president in April of 45. The Manhattan Project, University of Chicago, 1942. In 1942, scientists at the University of Chicago produced the first controlled atomic chain reaction. FDR was persuaded to develop an atomic weapon. They believed the Germans were working on it already. They were. The Germans were working on a bomb of sorts, a massive bomb that would be incredibly destructive and would guarantee them winning the war. Had the Germans developed a nuclear or atomic bomb and been able to implement that in the war, well, that would have certainly changed everything. The project cost us $2 billion. It is thought to be the most secret project in American history. Nobody knows about it. No one. People are sworn to secrecy under threat of treason or execution. 120,000 people worked on it, hidden from everyone, hidden from Congress. You have to wonder how Congress, because Congress has to appropriate all monies. That's what Congress does, one of their duties. So Congress had to have appropriated and given $2 billion to the government. Where the hell was it used? I guess it was probably pretty easy to hide it with all the money being given out, subsidizing private industry and the war production. I suppose $2 billion, just no one noticed. Big failing on Congress, their oversight of Congress. Nonetheless, FDR approved it. The program comes to a head right around the time FDR dies. They notify Truman. They tell Truman it's there. He had no idea. And they say, oh, by the way, we've got this bomb we've been working on. Oh, hey, another bomb. Okay, lots of bombs. No, this bomb can actually destroy entire cities with one bomb. Million times more powerful than anything else he created. The bomb was successfully tested on July 16th, 1945. Successfully tested. And he's informed of this, and he's told, well, put it this way. He's informed and it's debated. They make no less than, I think, about 17 different reports and from different experts about all of the different scenarios of how to defeat the Japanese, because Germany surrendered, but Japan has not. So it's a matter of how many different ways, how can we figure out to defeat Japan? And they make up all these different scenarios, all the different plans, all these different arguments, all talking about, in essence, how many people are going to die to get Germany, pardon me, to get Japan to surrender? How many more are going to die? And estimates are wide ranging. They estimate ranges from 50 to 100,000 all the way up to several million. And this is Americans and Japanese. How many will die to do this? Ultimately, the argument is convincingly made to Truman that to drop the bombs, which would kill a lot of people, which would then shock the Japanese into surrendering, would ultimately result in a less loss of life for both sides. Because most estimates did actually believe that if we had to invade the island of Japan to actually fight city to city to get Japan to surrender, could cost 1 million Japanese lives and at least 500,000 American lives, 1.5 million deaths. However, dropping a bomb on a city, killing 20 or 40, 50,000 people would do enough to scare Japan into surrender. So the less loss of life rationale wins. And of course, the less loss of life rationale means mostly Americans will not die. Very few Americans will die in this, although potentially tens of or hundreds of thousands of Japanese will die. It seems pretty obvious the Japanese weren't going to surrender. We know the Japanese had actually been training school kids. They had movies training school kids on how to fight, elementary kids, training them how to fight and defend themselves and how to make weapons out of school supplies. Those videos exist. You can look them up on the internet. Um, Japan was preparing to literally fight to every man, woman, and child to protect themselves and defend the honor of their country from these American people, these American monsters. Um, Truth be told, dropping the bombs probably did save lives. But at the time, the lives they were most, of course, concerned about was American lives. They dropped the first bomb in Hiroshima on August 6th. Japan did not surrender. They dropped the second bomb in Nagasaki on August 9th. Even then, it still takes Japan another week to surrender. Good that they did. We didn't have a third. We hadn't built another bomb yet. They were in the process of building more, but they only had these two bombs. Was it Little Man, Fat Boy, Little Man, yeah, I think Fat Boy, Little Man is what they named them. One was much bigger than the other. Anyway, they drop the two bombs and they kill ultimately from the immediate killing and those that die afterwards of radiation poisoning in the immediate months. About 250,000 people die. About 250,000 Japanese lose their lives, either in the initial explosion or in the aftermath of it due to radiation poisoning and things like that, or their injuries. Almost 250,000 Japanese die of this. Japan surrenders. Still, again, it takes a week after the second bomb. And this is after we had been firebombing Japan for weeks and months. We'd been attacking them, firebombing. Entire cities were already obliterated. Tens of thousands of Japanese people had already died. They just wouldn't surrender. They were fanatical, willing to die for their cause, their belief, which was incredibly misguided. It was a racist, prejudicial belief. So it was a very misguided cause. Nonetheless, it seemed like the whole country was willing to die for it. The Manhattan Project occurs, the war ends. This gives you an idea of World War II in the Pacific in the beginning, you can see here to where the Japanese pretty much controlled, we call this the whole Japanese sphere of influence. They controlled pretty much the entire Western Pacific after Pearl Harbor. Then later, When the Americans finally come on the move, you can see the blue lines there. In 42, 43, and 44, Americans attack. They start taking islands one by one by one, and it's brutal. Most of our casualties we had in World War II were in the Pacific. Um, because every island that we took, they could bomb the island, they could destroy the ships, but they had to actually send in the Marines to take every island one by one, face to face, many times hand to hand combat, digging through tunnels, running through the jungles. Many times men were fighting and killing each other with bayonets and knives. Every island had to be fought for and taken foot by foot, mile by mile. The ships couldn't do any of that. They could bombard the islands, but they could only do so much. The men, the American Marines, had to take them back. And this was our biggest casualty loss, was the war in the Pacific that we fought mostly on our own. We did have assistance from other countries, India, China. We had assistance from Australia, but we were the ones that led. We were the tip of the spear, if that's the right way to put it, for the entire Pacific invasion against the Japanese, taking back every island. Some of these islands alone, we lost tens of thousands of soldiers dead on single islands. It was terrible. It was worse than what we had to deal with in Europe. But we had to do it. And here you can see the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You can see the explosions there. These weren't the original targets either. They had to change the targets due to weather conditions. Um, the targets were to be military targets, purely military installations with some civilian casualties. Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended up being a larger percentage of civilian casualties than was planned. But it was necessary at the time, they believed, to do this. They needed to bomb Japan into submission. And I'm glad, glad that they did finally come to their senses and surrender. Otherwise, who knows how many more lives would have been lost as they went through this. Here we can see a picture of the devastation after Hiroshima the following year. Almost everything's gone. You have a handful of structures still standing, but in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at ground zero, within a couple miles of the bombs, about 92% of all standing structures were destroyed. So 92% of all standing structures within a couple of miles of the explosions. And the way atomic bombs work is they don't hit the ground. They actually come down and I don't know how the distance, a mile or something, or that's probably wrong. I don't know the distance. A certain distance above the ground, they explode, and then all the force is directed down onto the land. They don't actually hit the ground and explode. This allows them to have much greater explosive potential. Instead of hitting the ground and then literally half of the explosive potential just goes into the ground and doesn't really do anything, here you have the entire explosive potential just being able to wash over a land and do massive amounts of damage. Uh, we didn't understand radiation either back then because the U.S. military sent in soldiers after the bombs were dropped to go in and assess the damage and to record it. You can see videos online where they had videos where they went around and recorded with cameras all with what it looked like afterwards, and they're just wearing regular uniforms, no protective gear. Most of those men were dead within a year. The cameramen, the soldiers, the troops, the Americans, almost all dead within a year of radiation poisoning. We had no real understanding. We opened a Pandora's box here. I mean, look at where we are today. Nuclear weapons, ICBMs. I mean, there's thousands of nuclear warheads around the world. We could obliterate all human life 10 times over with the nuclear capability we have in the world today. It all started here. We started it. It should be noted, though, it would have happened anyway. The Germans are working on it. The Soviets are working on it. We were working on it. So if we hadn't discovered it, someone else would have. So even though we get the infamy of being the first, oh, and by the way, the only country in the world to drop atomic weapons on a population center. The only one, us. We did it. We're the only two that's ever been dropped on people. Anyway, it would have happened eventually. Someone else would have figured it out and done it. Again, other countries are working on it. But we had no real understanding of radiation in this time period. We didn't really get the long-term effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the atomic weapons. Not at all. Here you have the big three. You have Winston Churchill over here, FDR in the middle, and of course Stalin. And even in this image, you can see the separation of East and West. Churchill and FDR are conversing. Stalin, in his uniform, is looking off away. Now, I don't know if Stalin understood English. I have no idea, but they would have all had translators, so they could have communicated. But it already shows this division of East and West, which leads us into the Cold War. This separation of our different allies who were allies, which comes to dominate geopolitics for the next 50 years. All right, well, that's it. And that's the end of the chapter. And we'll see you next week. Bye.